before we get started, I just want to officially acknowledge that VocalEye is broadcasting to you all this evening through the magic of Zoom, but from the unceded, ancestral, and traditional territories of the Squamish, the Musqueam, and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And again, we all have the privilege of joining through this magical Zoom technology. And I would certainly invite each of you to take a moment and learn about the lands that each of you are settled on. It's important work that we are all asked to do. And so in your time, I would invite you to do that. Officially welcome to VocalEye, April 21st, 2021. This is our 41st. That would be big 4-1 virtual VocalEye event. So that's pretty exciting. We've sustained the pandemic. And tonight we're going to view Crip Camp, a disability revolution. It's approximately an hour and 40 minutes long. And our special guest tonight is going to be Alfiya Battalova, who I will introduce to you in just a moment. For those of you who don't know me, because we do have some new folks, my name is Amy. I'm the Community Outreach Coordinator for VocalEye and, of course, a member of the blind community. And I'll be your host for this evening, as I am every Wednesday evening. I want to just flag for folks while I have your captive, undivided attention. At least that's what Zoom tells me, because there's no audio feedback. I just want to let you know what's coming up next week so that everybody is aware. Next week would be April 28th. That we're going to present our crowdsourced description project. And some of you may remember that we put out a questionnaire to the blind community in every space that we could possibly find. We even had some submissions from places like Madagascar, asking folks what visual art forms they would like to have described. And we got a ton of responses. And so we kind of whittled it down to the top 4. And then we took those and we asked a bunch of folks to describe them, folks that were professional describers, folks that weren't professional describers. And the idea is just to get description from different lenses of different folks and see how different that is. So we're going to share that work with you next week. So I'm pretty excited about that. And then on May the 5th, we're going to have an audio play to listen to, and it's called You Can't Get There From Here. And this audio play is out of Toronto's Factory Theatre. And our special guests will be podcasters Christine Malik and JJ Hunt. So that's going to be fun, folks. And that's what's coming up in the next couple of sessions. But let's get back to tonight's session. And as friends know, we do something different every week. So, if it's not your cup of tea this week, it may be next week. But spread the word. Everybody is welcome in this space. And I also just want to give a quick shout out to those who have made donations, because we offer this free of charge to our friends in the blind community. But if you have the capacity to make a donation, we'll post a link in the chat, and no obligation, but this programming is offered on the contributions of donations in part. Okay, friends, I feel myself chatting too much. I want to just bring Alfiya into the space. Alfiya Battalova, my friend, where are you? I know you're here.
I am
What's
here.
in the background? There you are. I hear your
Hello.
voice. This is how Zoom works. You're not here until I hear you. How are you this evening, Alfiya?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me. I'm very excited.
I'm so excited too. And so, Alfiya, folks in this space aren't going to know you in your professional capacity. So I would love for you to share with us your academic background.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me just also start by, briefly describing myself. I'm a white woman with brown hair pulled back, and then I wear glasses, and I wear like a dark shirt with a dark blue shirt with some white stripes and pink stripes on it. So I'm originally from Russia, so you'll hear a slight accent. But I'm not Russian ethnically. I'm a Tatar, which is one of the ethnic groups from Russia that lives on the territory of Russia. But so I have a background in disability studies, and I'm not sure if any of you heard of this field, but it's a fairly new field that emerged as a result of the events that you will actually see in the film. So I'm thrilled about this because I know I heard about these events because of disability studies and how much it contributed to how we view disability and activism. And so yeah, and then I identify as a person with a disability. I grew up, I had cancer when I was 12, and my leg was amputated. I guess it was the same diagnosis that Terry Fox had, osteogenic sarcoma. So yeah, I was certainly always, I kind of excited, and I wanted to learn more about different non-medical ways of talking about disability. And when I moved first to the US to do my graduate studies, I just learned about this whole new world of disability studies, and the way to look at disability from the social model, where actually it's not your diagnosis that makes you disabled, but the environment around you. And it just, yeah, it was incredible to learn about something like this after years of kind of living with kind of internalized ableism, and thinking that, yes, it's you that's the problem. So it's yeah, I guess. And then right now my work is very much focused on disability advocacy. I'm working with local, by local I mean Lower Mainland, so British Columbia, Lower Mainland communities, municipalities that have advisory committees of people with disabilities, and I'm kind of learning a little bit more about the kind of work they do, and how that work is translated into accessibility policies on the local level. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's where I am. And another thing that I'm really excited about is that I had a pleasure of meeting one of the people in the film, Judith Human. And I think at the time I actually didn't even appreciate how cool she is. So it just kind of happened to.
What was the circumstance? How you met her, Alfiya?
Yeah, it was interesting. So I came as an exchange student to the US when I was 16, and it was one of the first programs that they built to kind of improve the relationship between the former Soviet republics and the United States. And so they brought, there was a competition, so they selected a few young people to come to the US for an exchange year. So I spent 1 year living in a host family, with a host family in Minnesota. And so there's not much change in terms of the climate, because I'm actually from Siberia. So in that sense, there was not much adjustment, but there's certainly lots of adjustment culturally. And so they brought us, kind of after a few months of living there, they said, oh, we are inviting you to come to Washington, D.C. to maybe kind of for a brief tour. And I don't think I knew at the time what that tour will involve. And just one day, I remember they introducing us to Judith Human. And I think she was telling probably some of the stories that she's telling in
this film.
But I think I was just too young, and I don't think I knew much at the time to kind of to realize the importance of the moment. But now that I think about it, I feel so lucky.
Were you on the steps where the 504 movement?
Yes.
You were, hey? Okay. Well, yeah. Once people see the film, we'll be able to unpack that.
Absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, I'm excited about that. So yeah, it's and then later on, when I was doing an internship, I connected with Center for Disability Rights in Rochester, New York. And again, I don't think I've done enough research, but it turned out that this center is one of the, I guess, places where ADAPT, another organization that you'll hear about in the film, was based. And they invited me to actually attend some of the protests they were doing. So it was, and they told me, you know what, you're on a visa, it might be dangerous for you. We don't want you to do anything that you don't feel comfortable doing. But we did go on a bus to Washington, D.C. from Rochester, New York, and I actually participated in a protest over there. So
wow,
it was.
So you have a deep relationship with this film just because there's some connectivity there.
I know. Yes, absolutely. So, when the film came out last year, I was just, excited that the stories are finally there. They are not just stories that, we know just in a small group of people but the stories that are shared widely. And now it's nominated for Oscars, and it's,
So
yeah.
for folks that don't know, and we just have a couple minutes left, Alfiya, but for folks who don't know, maybe just set up the world that we're in. This is a film that's got a lot of archival footage from the 70s and 80s. So just unpack that a little bit for us.
Yeah, so there's lots of archival footage. There there'll be several kind of time points that the film will be focusing on. First, the time at the camp itself, but then it will bring you slowly to the 70s and the events that happened at that time and how that connected to disability rights movement, and then to the 90s, at the time when the Americans with Disability Act was signed into law. So yeah, so there's like that interesting trajectory of events that happened throughout the years, but that all kind of are very important to understand a whole picture of
Right.
of the movement.
And I think what folks, I mean, kind of what struck me as icky only because I live in 2020 and 2021, like when this film was released, because of a lot of this is archival footage. They throw that word handicapped around quite a bit. So
That's right.
just for folks to be aware, that was obviously a very popular term when the archival footage was captured. But it really
That's
like
right.
it's like almost in the first line of the film. You're like,
Yes.
whoa, wait, what did I just hear? So content warning if folks are triggered by that word, but it's still a relevant piece of our history. And by our, obviously, it's US history, and we do have folks from the US on the line with us tonight. But it's important history because it is precedent-setting history, and we can all learn from that. And how we can make change. So I'm really excited to get into this. And I know we've got a couple of folks just trickling in the last minute that we're together, Alfiya. You're going to stick around and join us after the film, and then we'll chat a little bit about, obviously, the film, but also a little bit about maybe some of the Canadian history around the disability rights movement. And
Sure.
folks can ask some questions because you're much more well-versed in that information than I am, which is why we called you a special guest this evening. So really excited to have you stick around for us afterwards. And then folks, also don't forget that we have a draw this evening. So if you identify with blindness or partial sight and you're on the call at the time of the draw, you are eligible to win the raffle prize, and we'll make the raffle prize sort of relevant to your regional geographic area. So instead of picking a prize in advance, we're just gonna communicate with you afterwards and let you know what you've won based on what area you live in. Well, my trusty smartphone is telling me that it's 7:00 Pacific time for our friends in the future. That could be any other time, but I think I'm going to ask Rick to go ahead and play Crip Camp, and we'll see you all on the flip side. All righty. Welcome back, friends. That was Crip Camp. Hope you all enjoyed that. We're going to welcome Alfiya back into our space. Welcome, Alfiya. So lots to unpack here. And again, friends in our audience, if you have questions for Alfiya about the film or about maybe some of the things, and we'll get into this, some of the things that around the disability rights movement in Canada. But first of all, how do you feel when you watch this documentary?
Yeah, I teared up a couple of times. But yeah, it's, and no matter like my, I don't know, third time probably watching it, it's, yeah, there's lots of different ideas there for sure. Like for me, things around coalition building, right? Working across disabilities, across other movements, that was so prevalent. And I loved how they, highlighted that interdependence, the idea of, you don't have to, even though it's called independent living movement, it's not independence in its traditional kind of way. It's really kind of relying on each other and making sure everyone's
community.
Yeah, community, exactly.
Yeah.
Creativity of disabled people. I love that. Like just coming up with solutions, because we have to navigate the world, inaccessible world, and we kind of have to come up with solutions right there on the spot. So I really, really appreciated how they talked about that. The idea somebody shared there that the law is not everything. The law is just maybe first step to change. And so that was very powerful. And I agree actually with that. It's not a destination. It's rather a tool that we can use for change. Gosh, what else?
The way they were like doing some myth busting, right, around the disability experience, because there are lots of folks of able body who are going to be watching this, and I love it teenagers when they get into the sex talk, because it's like nobody expects this to happen, right? And it's like, wait a second, these are teenagers, like, of course, right? So I love that kind of, and they obviously loved that too, but I just love the way that they're debunking that myth that folks with disabilities are all asexual beings and don't have lives or enriching relationships, or that our our family members are our caregivers, all of those kinds of myths. So I kind of love that about this too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And another thing I really appreciated was the kind of discussion, even some uncomfortable discussions, conversations we might not necessarily talk a lot about in disability community as well. It's this hierarchy of disability idea, right? And it's, I think the way they talked about it and how the camp allowed them to recognize, to see the truth in other people's lives. It's extremely powerful. It's seeing people for who they are. And so I wonder, I don't know if I can ask the audience a question. I'm just kind of, I don't know if that's something.
You can pose a question. We can't necessarily force anybody to answer. But
no, for sure. Well, I'm just curious if people have an idea, or maybe you, Amy, have like some thoughts around the term Crip, and what do you think about it? And it's kind of use of the word in the title of the film. Obviously they use a lot of the old, also like you mentioned, handicap. That is so the language definitely changes.
Yeah.
So
I think the term Crip is nostalgic for a lot of folks from the generation of the folks that we're talking about. I don't have any personal issues with it in terms of if folks from the disability community want to use it, but I actually don't think that our able-bodied friends should be referring to us in that way. I think that's kind of like their club language. Sometimes people say things like, oh, I'm on Crip time, but able-bodied person says to me, oh, you're on Crip time, that seems disrespectful. But if I want to create Crip time as running a little bit late because I got lost on my journey because I didn't navigate properly, then maybe. But in general, though, I don't use the word, and it's not necessarily a conscious choice. I just don't have a necessity for it. So, but it certainly doesn't bother me when community members use it. But it does a little bit when outsider folks and friends. If you've got questions for Alfiya or want to comment on the film or anything we're talking about, please, you can use the raise your hand function. That's probably the easiest way to do this. And but we'll just keep chatting until that happens. So
I just wanted to kind of mention around the Crip term, like there's like some history behind it as well, because it's the idea of reclaiming something that is that was used in a derogatory way. And you're
Mhm.
right, it's only meant to be used by people with disabilities themselves to refer to
I
themselves.
love it that the academic confirms what I'm saying.
That's right. So it's about reclaiming, and I can see people. I think people have questions.
We do have some hands up. So we'll go to Dawn first, and then we'll go to Karim, and then we'll go to Megan. So go ahead, Dawn, with your question or your comment.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for showing this. It was very powerful and really interesting to be able to trace these people's lives from when they were kids and met at camp. Talking about language, I totally agree. If non-disabled persons use terms that we consider pejorative, I'm not in favor of that. I get a little fed up. Sometimes people get wound up about language. For instance, handicap doesn't offend me. I understand why some people don't like it, because the origin was disabled persons who were begging. I think in the Middle Ages, the cap in hand is where it came from. But it doesn't offend me, just as, for instance, if somebody calls me blind, I am blind, I'm not offended. And yet I remember a gathering where one young person was in tears because somebody called her blind, and she was blind. So, but we have to be sensitive to each other and try and be respectful. If something offends somebody else, be aware of that.
Thanks, Dawn. Yeah,
Okay.
Thanks for that.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Yeah.
Karim, go ahead.
Hi, Amy. Hi, Alfiya. Good to see you
Hello.
again.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Yes, yeah. Saying, in terms of using the term cripple, as Amy said, it's a community term, just the same as a certain word is used within the Black African American community. It's not a good idea to use it outside that community if you don't happen to be part of that ethnic group. Right. And as far as the movie goes, I want to hear your thoughts on this. That this movie goes from the 70s to hopefully today, or pretty close to that. The fight to get the Americans with Disabilities Act passed in 1992, and the comparison of that with the Canadian Accessible Canada Act. Right? Where do you see the similarities, or where do you see differences? Do you think the ACA matches the ADA, or does it have a ways to go?
Yeah, no, thank you for the question, Karim. Well, I definitely am not an expert on the Canadian history. I'm not a historian, but from kind of my research on the topic, I can say that there were some parallels in terms of the movements. For sure, veterans influenced the development of the disability movement in Canada, and the kind of laws and ideas around rehabilitation that were introduced to the society. So that was common. Canada also had that independent living movement, and protests too. So in terms of the differences, I would say that Canada has, for example, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, right? And so there was a big protest, and then like 1980, when there was discussion around including disability into one of the sections there, section 15. And so like some members of there was a coalition of provincial organizations of the handicap, that was the name. They have been kind of lobbying for the inclusion of disability as one of the characteristics, as one of the sections. And they were successful. So they went to the Parliament Hill, waving signs, placards, and it was a cross disability protest, and turned out to be successful. In terms of how it compares to the federal law now, I think the difference is in terms of the political structure, right? So we know that, for example, Ontario has its own law, Ontarians with Disabilities Act, and and it's now becoming a trend across different provinces. Like each province will probably at some point have some sort of a legislation accessible.
We're developing the BC one right now. Yeah,
that's right, exactly. So there's less kind of I don't think that the federal legislation has a lot of teeth to it. I certainly don't see it that way. I mean, there's some hope for the provincial level legislation, but it certainly comes to, I see it as like this difference in sort of political structure. And then of course, Canada, the way jurisdictions and levels of jurisdictions scope is determined, like the provinces are in charge of healthcare, education, that sort of thing. So, and then it translates in how people with disabilities, advocate for certain things. A lot of the times it's advocacy for services, for specific, rights in that area, not necessarily in the same way that that it happened in the US for like more like anti-discrimination type of level changes. So there are some kind of nuances and differences on that level. And I also read that yes, Canada had some cross disability movement, but not as much. Like from the very beginning, from the 60s, 70s, there were lots of organizations that were specific to, a disability, a particular disability. And so, there was less sort of cross disability work.
Yeah, we don't feel, it doesn't feel like we rally the same.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
But we also don't have the same numbers in terms of population too.
True.
So there's
Well,
some things there.
Well, I was going to say, comparatively, we do, because we're 10% the population of the US, and the disability community is 15 to 20% of the Canadian population. So I was going to say, Amy, are you up for it? You want to do a sit-in?
Do you know? Maybe. I don't know if I can
Bring your
sleep on
sleeping bag.
I don't know if I can sleep on the floor anymore. I'm a little old for that, but
Well, we'll come prepared with sleeping bags and sleeping pads.
That's right. We one of the things that I was just personally invited to do was be on a tech committee for the Canadian Accessibility Act.
Okay.
In order to help develop standards across Canada. So, we'll see what happens. That's the whole process of them choosing folks. So that's, I think we're still working out the details of the Canada Act. So it's going to take some time before that's in place. Great question, Karim. Thanks for that. Let's open the floor to
yesterday or today.
And then Karen, and then Mark.
I'll do it after this talk.
So go ahead, Megan.
Shitting in a box. So I think maybe who's helping is tell me. That's my hope anyway.
Megan, are you able to unmute yourself? Just give Megan a moment here.
Okay.
We got you.
Well, yes.
Awesome.
Yes. Actually, for me, because I agree with that totally. Because I've got a lot of friends with disabilities, and I've met I met some friends at a camp in near Kelowna, Camp Winfield or Camp Easter Seal, and then for people with all disabilities. And I met some friends there, and it was I still have them. And I was like, a lot of my friends I still have them. And yeah, great. So yeah, in the States, they had to do a lot of rallying and stuff. But if we were to do the sitting in that rallying, I would do it in a different way, wouldn't you think? Because like sleeping on the floor with on the floor, and we'd have to bring lots of if some people that may need medication like growth hormone or something like that,
Yeah. That's true.
It would be too much. It would be too much.
I think today's sit-in looks like Twitter posts.
No, yeah.
It looks like a social media bomb of some kind. Yeah.
Yeah, for
Mhm,
sure.
mhm, 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 mhm.
Thanks
they
for the
were
comment,
quite-
Megan. And it's really nice that you have friends from camp, because it's such a
Yeah.
beautiful thing when you find your community, right?
Mhm, yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Thanks for
It's
sharing
true.
that.
It's interesting, like the camp, you might think, oh, it again wasn't like it again only for people with disabilities, but then that sort of experience brought people together, and so
Mhm.
yeah, that's just, I don't know, just
They united under that banner for
yeah,
sure.
absolutely.
Yeah, it's a
Mhm.
real beautiful thing. I'm gonna open the floor to Karen next. Karen has a comment or a question
hi,
for us.
yeah. Thank you so much for bringing this forth. I am so emotional. I think I went through a box. I think I went through a box of Kleenex.
Yeah, I know, I hear you.
I hear
Um,
you too. I hear you too. Absolutely.
And as Dawn mentioned, it was extremely powerful. I've spent my whole life advocating for individuals with disabilities, or different able bodies, as I like to say. As a child, even as young as 10, um, I was supporting and friends with individuals with disabilities. We had the only school in our community that had an integrated program. I continued that through my teenage years and even as an adult. And I ended up giving birth to 2 children that were preemies that had disabilities. So I think that all prepared me for this in life. And then, of course, as an adult,
Mm.
I was one of those adults that was standing on the steps of City Hall and chairing, our program, or our organization for children with all varying disabilities and abilities, the integrated program that people from all over the country, all across Canada, came to move to our community because we had the best programs. And I stood up, as it was said by one of the ladies, I stood up against a government employee. I believe it may have been Judy, and spoke out about how difficult it is to be a parent and how difficult it is to be an individual with disabilities. And this gentleman ended up quitting his government job and became an executive director for a nonprofit. So with all that being said, and how important it is to stand up as a parent, I was so impressed with all these young people standing up and advocating for themselves, because I think that speaks volumes. And so somebody
Even for us, even for us living in Canada, we have a lot of thanks to give to these folks who blazed a trail, and folks like yourself too, who blazed a trail for the rest of us to follow.
I grew up during that time. I grew up during the 60s, 70s, 80s, through that time change was happening. And so thanks. And see, and I thought that it was my responsibility as a friend and a person in the community, and thus a parent. So with all that being said, for somebody who's worked so hard on your degrees and working through the disability community, how have you seen the progression of inclusion, and what types of changes do you see that are being needed? And again, thank you so much for bringing this forward, and thank you so much for everything that you do for our country, and for North America and the US and Russia, because that's my family homeland. Although my uncle did get kicked out of Siberia, it is our family home.
My grandfather was born in Russia too.
Oh, there you go.
Alfiya, although you're from Qatar. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
Thanks, Karen. That's really great, thoughts and feedback, and thank you for being so transparent with it. Alfiya, what do you think about
Yeah.
the ask around any changes you've seen in your
Any changes?
career.
It's I see it as yeah, thank you so much, Karen, for sharing. Yeah, and thank you for all you do. I feel like the small sometimes small acts of advocating that cumulatively make a change. So that's absolutely so important. So I think as I'm seeing things right now, and I'm sort of, there's a sort of more academic disability community that's using sometimes their own language. And that's sort of more disability justice oriented, and they differentiate that from disability rights, because as one of the person mentioned, yeah, rights is just one piece of the puzzle, but we need to actually change the system, like address ableism on a much more systemic level. So that's what's behind disability justice movement. But I also see it as multiple movements in a way, because I started doing this research with local municipalities, with people serving on the advisory committees. There's lots of things people sometimes don't realize, that the changes that happening on the local level are the changes that affect you the most in many ways, and they're not necessarily kind of seen or recognized as important, but those are all your things around infrastructure, things around transportation. Those decisions are made on the local level. So I see definitely lots of positive changes over the years. At least there's some from the people I talked to so far, it sounds like there's at least more recognition from the general public of the need to make things accessible. So you don't necessarily have to, sometimes they come in and introduce something already having some considerations for accessibility in mind. Not always, and not everyone, but at least it's there in the discussion, in the, people understand that it's probably important to consult with people with disabilities on certain things that affect them. So that's there. I mean, there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of moving from sometimes tokenism, just having disabled person in the room, to actually listening to them and making sure that they're engaged in a meaningful way. And I feel like that is still, there's a gap there.
Lots of room. Yeah.
Yes, for sure. I mean, and there's, because there's so many right now, different disability organizations, it's interesting. A lot of them are doing incredible work. But, to me, I wish there was a way sometimes to combine the efforts, join the efforts to make that change much more impactful. Some just kind of bring it to the bigger scale, because and I understand that's the limit. Like, lots of nonprofit organizations are struggling, they have to rely on donations, and it's very hard to
You're right, though. We do a lot of this work in silos.
Yeah, that's
instead of the whole community coming together like they did in Crip Camp or 504, it's the blind community advocating for what they need, and wheelchair users advocating for what they need. So and again, that's about the rally, right? Like, when do we just say, wait a second, for you is good for us, and let's figure this out, because we have a stronger voice in numbers.
Exactly.
And I completely agree with that, because when I sat on the board of directors for our organization, one of the things that we did, because we support children from birth to 18 years of age, I also encouraged the Community Living Society to come on with us and meet with us every 3 months to discuss what was needed to be able to move from youth into adulthood. And then another thing that I came up with, because as you mentioned, there's so many different organizations, I said it would be great to have a one-stop shop, because so many parents that are facing these barriers that might not know where to go need to be able to pick up the phone and be able to call, like a 1-800 number so that they can know where to get all the supports, because clearly physicians don't. And I had been married to one, so he used to pick up the phone and call me and ask me what to tell his patients. And we have since, which I'm thrilled, 30 years later, but I'm still thrilled that we have what is called 211 now. I believe that you can pick up the phone and call and find out anything you need to know in the province of BC. So it would be wonderful to see that, as you mentioned, Alfiya, to get all organizations, and even if they're able to do a Zoom, conference with the executive directors or board members, and being able to do that, several times a year, to be able to see how they can help move forward.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great comment.
Excellent.
Thanks, Karen. We're gonna, we've got a couple more hands here. So I'm gonna just acknowledge that we've got Mark, we've got Tilo Nuko, and we've got Linda Bartram, and then that'll be the end of our speakers list, friends. So go ahead, Mark, I'll let you have the floor. Ask or share your comment.
Yeah, thank you. I really mostly just wanted to say thanks. I really loved the documentary. It definitely made me choke up at certain points, but the other thing though, it was super funny. Like there were lots of laugh out loud moments throughout that whole documentary.
Very
so
much.
really loved the whole thing. That only sort of kind of question, there's so many things that really struck me, but one was how much they were willing to make themselves unignorable, right? So shutting down a street, a busy street I think it was New York, but in a major city. Of course, the sit-in that lasted almost 2 weeks, that sort of thing. Our advocacy is so much less intrusive,
Passive,
right? Like,
yeah.
yes. And so part of me is sad that we're not out there doing those kinds of things. At the same time, times have changed, and people that you may turn off people by doing those sorts of things. So I'd just be interested if either of you has a sort of comment on, some of those tactics that are a bit more in your face, a bit harder to ignore, that maybe even make people feel uncomfortable in some ways. And if you think, it would actually be a good thing if we had a bit more of that.
A lot of the work that I do, Mark, and when I wear some of my other hats, sometimes you actually have to embarrass people into doing the right thing, right? It's like one of those things that just kind of has to happen, especially around ableism. And sometimes I use a little bit of humor to point out the ableism, and sometimes it's just really about kind of, it's once they realize that they've done, you know what I mean? And sometimes that's just the way that it needs to happen. Alfiya, what's your thoughts around things like sit-ins and
oh gosh,
in
well,
your face?
I know that like I think in the US some groups are still using those tactics, so that's certainly strategy to be considered. It's true. I don't know what's the place right now in the Canadian context for something like that. It does seem like we tend to be kind of focusing more on talking to each other, like more like, okay, just trying to listen to each other and having some sort of a discussion around it. And it's true, at some point if the change doesn't happen, no matter how much you talk to someone, you gotta ask yourself maybe like, what is there a place then for me to do something else, something that will attract attention, and yes, will be uncomfortable for me, because as people with disabilities, we're already sometimes at the center of attention, and then all of a sudden to put yourself again in that position of, okay, I'm a protester, I'm angry, like that idea of being seen as an angry, always like ungrateful and things like that. It has its own like kind of cost, I guess, right? But I think there's I don't know. It's a good question. I would just
the other thing too is that at the time, with this 504 movement and the Americans with Disabilities Act, they went from like nothing to something.
Yeah, true.
And we're not starting from nothing.
Right.
We have to build on the something that we have. And so sometimes it feels like, because we have sort of a foundation thing, that now it's like, now we got to pick, okay, now we got to focus on education, and then we focus on employment. And then so those things are also siloed.
Yes.
Right. And so the way we advocate is also different. You almost have to pick your and then go fight that one and then come back to the, to the troops and then go out and fight another battle.
Yeah.
So it's a different world in advocating, but I certainly hear what Mark's saying about, who knows if that rallying cry comes, it'll come over social media, that. So if you're on social media, that's the place to
Well,
watch.
actually, yeah, there's like in the US during the, I think 2016 election, there was a whole social media campaign, Crip the Vote.
Yes, I remember. That's right.
Remember that? Yes. So there was there's a different type of advocacy now where like it's still a community effort, and those some analysis even done of those tweets. But yeah, people with disabilities are like, we want to hear the word disability mentioned in the programs of the candidates. Like, just we have,
and that's another
yeah.
great point, Alfiya, which is that statistically folks with disabilities don't get out and vote, and so it's a place to start, right? Is just vote, let your voice be heard, and tell your candidates what it is you need them to do. Awesome. Gosh, we could talk about this all night. I'm getting really excited. Tilo and Yuko are up next, and then Linda. So Tilo and Yuko, I'll let you have a moment. I'm off. Awesome.
Hello, this is Tilo.
Tilo.
Hello.
Yeah. This was a eye-opener for me. I knew other disabilities had their own set of problems, but I never thought about anything about how these movements. I always remember, I guess, what the media had shown on there, and never heard about any about disabilities about that. Having that said, and it was sometimes I cried, and then there were some moments that, like someone said, I laughed a lot, and it was great that they followed some of the people through the whole thing, from childhood to adulthood. I enjoyed that very much, but also when my mom and my dad had divorced, there was a time period that maybe year and a half, maybe almost 2 years, I was put in a shelter with my sister, who's younger than I am. She also has a disability, also being visually impaired. She has Down syndrome. And they separated us. And one day I went up to the second floor where she was, or actually was the first floor, they call it. And I just wanted to talk with her and just sit with her. And they scolded me to the point that that day they had a movie I wasn't allowed to. And they told me if I was caught again, I would go to bed with no dinner. And I was wondering why. And I tried to ask questions, and they kept telling me to be quiet and don't say anything. So I was good, and I never did see my sister. And later on, after divorce, we were separated, and I guess she was adopted out, and never heard from her. And then later on, as an adult, there was a newspaper article in Calgary that this handicapped person, and they said her name, and that she was looking for her family, and she was recording different things she kind of remembered a little bit. And one of my older sisters saw that in the newspaper. I think it was her friend that saw it and told my sister to look at it. And she read it and she investigated, and it turned out it was our sister. And there's the resemblance that, what I could see when I saw her, she could be my twin, even though she was born 3 years younger than I am. She's shorter than I am, and she's kind of tubby. But she works off and on. She worked for a while in veterinarian until she happened to have an allergy with dog cat hair. And then she worked for Build-A-Bear for a while. That craze that was going around. And she's been traveling, and she's done things that maybe places I haven't gone to, even though she's has attendant. The only thing that they have to help her with is her finances, because if she had it, she would spend everything. She'd have nothing. And she usually
I have
lives
the
in
same issue.
a group home. I'm sure everybody has a hole in the pocket like me. But this, you know, I wonder sometimes why society thinks this way. And I'm also think that living here in Canada, because other parts in the world you are shut in, or you family members treat you bad because you're blind, or you have some other disability,
Yep. Or you're institutionalized.
or
or
you're institutionalized. So I'm very thankful for I'm here, but I'm also very thankful for the people who fought for these rights for all of us.
Mhm. Yeah. Thank you, Tilo, for sharing that story.
Yeah,
Thank
so
you.
much. Yeah, I
Ah.
mean, the history of institutions is still kind of very prevalent in some parts of the world. Like I'm still doing some research in Russia, and also wrote recently about the system of institutional big institutions that still exist. They're kind of facilities for hundreds of people, and
It's the hardest thing for me about this film is when they
yeah,
start talking about the
exactly.
institution.
Mhm.
And the description does a pretty good job, but I mean, an image says 1,000 words, and I can't imagine what those images look like. But I can guesstimate based on what the describer tells me, right?
Mhm.
Our last question and comment comes from Linda. So Linda, the floor is yours, my friend.
Thank you. I just wanted to mention about the Accessible Canada Act and where we're at with that right now. Because
Please, yeah, you're quite involved.
I am involved. The Alliance AEBC is quite involved in consultations in regards to what's happened. We have the act in place, but it's just like a framework. And what's happening right now is the regulations are being developed, and that's where the real meat is. That's where the teeth are. And we're already seeing, some reluctance to actually put any teeth into the regulations. So we may well have to get out there and protest, folks, to make this act meaningful. So it is a concern when we see, that yes, you have to put a disability plan together, but you don't have to say how you're going to fix things or when you're going to fix things. So, it's all well and good to say, well, we have all these problems, but that's the end of it. We don't have to do anything about it. So anyways, I think it's part of our Canadian personality that we are polite and gentle and we don't protest, but I think that we need to more because
the time is coming.
I think the time needs to come. I don't know if it's coming, but it needs to come. And that, because that's how we look at what happened in that film where all these other, the unions, the Black Panthers, all of them rallied around to help. And probably they were not aware prior to those people doing the protests they were doing. Those individuals and those groups were not aware of the situation that was going on. So, we can do it through social media, but that doesn't necessarily really make everybody aware like a physical protest and international news and all that kind of stuff can really bring it to the forefront. So I just think we need to be less complacent. And as blind people particularly, I think we need to be less complacent about these things. We need to be prepared to put ourselves in a situation that might be a little uncomfortable if we're going to move the whole thing forward we're back in Canada in a way, in terms of the legislation anyways. We're back in the 70s, we're back 50 years ago. So we need to be prepared. So anyways, I just urge everybody to keep your keep abreast of what's happening, and yeah, and I'll keep everybody abreast of things as well if I can.
I think we got the leader of our rallying cry, folks. When Linda Bartram says call, we go.
Well, I was ready. I was ready when with this whole business with the bike lanes in Victoria,
Oh God.
and how we got a human rights complaint to actually say that the city had discriminated against us, but they're still doing it.
Yeah.
And I said, okay, guys, when are we going to go and lie down in the street or sit across the, stand across the bike lanes so none of the bikes can go by, and bring it to the attention. Sorry, that's my computer talking to me. And that we can, that we stop traffic and that we make the news. And, I'm not sure how many blind people would be willing to do that, but I think I grew up in that. I grew up in that era. I grew up in the 70s, but I was out of the country. I was really not very aware of what was going on in the disability movement in the States at all. I was living in Britain at the time. And so that was really enlightening to see that story and to see how this started with people at camp. Can you imagine Camp Bowen? And us going from Camp Bowen, those of you who know Camp Bowen, and getting together and going off and starting a disability movement.
I had to chuckle when you talked about all of us standing in the street together, because all I could think about was, as long as a sighted person steps out first.
No, know what? I'll step out first if everybody else comes with me.
Because that's a huge risk. But
I know.
I actually get what you're saying. We could time it when we step out when there's no traffic, so they have enough time to see us.
You can have people standing on the sidelines saying, "Go now."
That's right. We'll have our little conductors on the side. I love it.
We can walk back.
Here, Linda. Here.
I love it.
Corinne. Okay, I've got one on my side. Anyways, who's going to join?
That's why
with
I said
sleeping bags.
Get ready for a sit-in.
Okay, all right, good to hear. Okay,
we'll just have to wait
I'll
till
join.
BC Ferries brings us all out, right?
Yeah,
I'll join.
that was Louise. Okay, there's
Louise.
Yeah, we'll bring something more appropriate for you.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, I'll keep you.
I'll join you with my guide dog.
That's fine. White dogs, white canes.
We've got our own little Crip Camp right here, folks. We'll just gather every Wednesday. This is awesome.
Yeah, I've got all the camping gear, so
I'll come.
Awesome.
Right on, Kathy.
That's great. Okay, all righty.
Well, thanks, friends, for your comments. I want to just officially thank Alfiya, but before we let you go, we have to do our little raffle. And then anybody who wants to just stick around and chat for a little longer is most welcome to stay. But I'll call on Donna, because I know that Donna has got a bucket full of names in the background.
Here I am. All right. So, Alfiya, whenever you are ready, I don't even know what word you're going to say.
But you can
when
yell
you
out,
say a
Alfiya.
word.
I think let's go with Crip Camp, right?
Okay,
Awesome. I love
let's
it.
do it. So I am shaking up those names. So whenever you're ready, you can go ahead.
Crip Camp.
And the winner is Pierre.
Pierre, is Pierre still on the line with us?
I'm still here.
Congratulations, Pierre. You've won a raffle prize. That's so exciting.
Thank you.
Congratulations. We'll make sure we connect with you offline to figure out what your prize is and how we get it to you.
Oh, thank you. After such a wonderful evening.
Oh, I'm glad you enjoyed it. And thanks for joining us. We had quite a few new folks here tonight, and it was really great to have new people in the spaces and familiar people in the spaces. And so thanks to everybody. And thanks to my friend and our special guest, Alfiya Battalova, for sharing your knowledge around the academics of disability and your connection with this film and your lived experience. It really means a lot to have you in a space, especially in this context. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I had a blast.
You do good work, Alfiya, and you're making a difference, and even the research stuff that you do, the collection of the data is part of the change, right? We don't know what we need to change until we do the research on what the issues are. So that's all part of the puzzle.
All right. Well, have a good night. Thanks again. Yeah.
Have a lovely evening. And folks, if you need to, drop off, I know some of you are in the future and probably want to go to bed. And some of you might want to stick around and have a little chat for, let's see what I've got. Pacific time. I've got 9:28. So we'll go to about 9:35, friends. We'll give it a couple of minutes if folks want to stick around and chat. I'm all for that.